Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're diving into some of our research, analyzing how school board conflicts played out in the midterms. Here to help us wrap our heads around what we learned is staff writer Doug Kreneisel. Welcome back, Doug.
Glad to be back, Victoria.
What's new? It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a little while. A lot of politics been going on, but you've all been covering it very well. I've enjoyed listening to the last few episodes. Yeah, just kind of enjoying the new year, getting things set up for 2023.
I thought you were going to share that you just got a new cat.
I did just get a new cat. That is true. That is a thing that happened recently. And that's why I haven't been able to join you on the podcast. You know, it's a big commitment.
Well, since you're adding, this is number 3 now. It's a big responsibility. Jumping into the topic at hand, school board elections. We've been monitoring them in some way since we launched. Between 2006 and 2020, we covered an average of 23 recall efforts against an average of 52 school board members each year. That number increased to 92 school board recall efforts against 237 board members in 2021. Doug, what do you think sparked that change?
I would say coronavirus was a big thing at that point in time. If you can think back, way back when, to 2020, 2021, school reopening plans, masking requirements, things like that were kind of on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, a lot of parents' minds. And that definitely played into a few of those recall efforts and kind of led into that spike. But then additionally, we started to see more and more, they're related to schools, right? But more and more of these issues that seem to be speaking to social or cultural happenings beyond just the four walls of a school, where it's not just class sizes that we're talking about anymore or teacher funding. We're talking about different things in the curriculum, things along those lines. And so a lot of those issues started to play a bigger role around that time. And it was actually that spike in 2021 that kind of raised the flag for us to say, okay, what's happening in these elections right now? What's going on here? What's fueling this? Clearly, the public is getting more interested. And so we owe it to our readers to have some neutral, unbiased way of unpacking that information. And that's what led into kind of our tracking of conflicts in school board elections, which we've got a lot to dig through today.
Yes, we do. I'd be shocked if this episode isn't longer than an hour. No, just kidding. We've identified 3 core themes in these elections and conflicts where candidates are campaigning and acting on some of these, like you said, essential political debates happening in our country outside of schools. Could you describe those 3 core themes for our listeners, Doug?
Yeah, the 3 conflict issues that we have been focused on are race and education, critical race theory. So that includes things like the role of race in curricula and learning materials, as well as district-specific equity or diversity plans. Responses to the coronavirus pandemic, still a big issue, kind of talked about a little bit more these days in terms of just medical decisions in general. But that includes things like mask requirements, vaccine requirements, and in the past, reopening or distance learning plans. And then the third issue is sex and gender in schools, which includes sexual education curricula and learning materials, as well as the usage of gender-specific facilities like restrooms and locker rooms and things along those lines.
Let's jump into the elections where those issues have been playing out. We just recently wrapped up our analysis documenting the winning candidates in the 545 school board elections that we identified as involving at least one of these key conflicts. And I'm excited to get into the weeds with you, Doug. But first, how do we go about categorizing winning candidates?
This was actually a lot of fun because it's always great to pick through local candidates' websites and Facebook pages. They're usually a little bit more exciting, I feel, than the federal ones. But we examined their campaign materials, social media posts and comments that they've made. We looked at who endorsed these candidates. So like if they were endorsed by an organization that has a very clear stance on some of these issues, and listen to candidate forums, interviews, wherever we could find something where they were talking about these issues, we would look there and see if we could find out whether they said they were on one side of the issue or the other. And I should clarify what I mean by support and oppose. Take race and education, for example. If a winner said they want to get critical race theory out of schools, we would mark them as opposing as far as our categories are concerned. Whereas if a winner said they wanted to teach about historical trauma or create district equity and inclusion plans, we would mark them as supporting on that conflict in particular. And then once we identified a winner stance on all three topics, either supporting, opposing, or unclear, if we couldn't find anything or what we did find wasn't really definitive, then we would group them into these overall categories. And there were four of those: supporting, which means they supported at least one of these three topics and opposed none; opposing, meaning they opposed at least one of these topics and supported none; mixed, if they had a mixture of supporting and opposing stances; and then unclear, if we could not determine their stances on any of the three issues. I should also clarify before we dive into the figures and the facts and figures, the percentages we're about to rattle off are not win rates. It's not like the percentage of candidates with this stance won. Instead, they are the percentage of seats won by candidates based on these stances. It's a little bit different, but a necessary disclaimer to add at the start to clear up any confusion people might have.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Since there's only one outlier in how we'll be talking about these percentages, let's start with those incumbent performances.
Yes, so this is the one data point, correcting my previous statement, this is the one data point where this is a win rate because we know who the incumbents were ahead of time and we know who won or lost. In our regular coverage, which covers some of the largest districts in the country, between 2018 and 2021, 17% of school board incumbents lost re-election on average. But when we look at races all across the country, in and out of our coverage scope, where these conflicts pop up, the incumbent loss rate increases to around 31%, which is a pretty decent difference between the two figures. And that remained the case last November, when of the roughly 1,100 incumbents running in these conflict races, out of that total, 320 lost, for a loss rate of just under 30%.
Got it. So it seems like incumbents continue to be defeated at higher rates in races where these conflicts are coming up.
That appears to be the case, but I should add that this is sort of an apples and oranges comparison. We're comparing our regular coverage, which we have historical data on year after year, to our conflicts coverage, which just encompasses these single elections. Like I said, the districts we routinely cover each year are the 200 largest in the country plus any in the 100 largest cities. So these are big districts that we regularly cover. Whereas with these conflict races, we look at any district where we find a conflict. They might be ones we regularly cover, but more often than not, they aren't. They're smaller districts outside of our regular coverage scope. So the two groups occupy somewhat different universes. And it might be the case that a 30% loss rate in smaller districts is common, but we just don't have the historical data to know for sure if that's true.
Yeah, that's a great disclaimer. And of course, we at Ballotpedia and our listeners, I'm sure, love disclaimers because the more transparency, the better. There were a total of 1,779 seats up for grabs in 545 school districts where these issues played a factor. I know we have a lot of detailed information, but let's start with the big picture looking at those seats. What do we know on that front?
Of those 1,779 seats, right around 45% were won by candidates who we labeled supporting, meaning they were either in favor of equity plans, mask requirements, or LGBTQ policies, for example. 31% of seats were won by candidates we labeled opposing, meaning they opposed those types of initiatives. 1%, just 25 of the winners out of those 1,800 had mixed stances. So a mixture of supporting and opposing stances. And then the remaining 23%, they were unclear on all three topics.
And how does that compare to previous analyses we've done? You've been on before talking about these conflicts and mentioned we had looked at the results in April of 2022 and November of 2021. Is what we saw in the midterms part of the course?
Yeah, pretty much. Keep in mind, each of those analyses involve different sets of elections, so they aren't directly comparable. Right? It wasn't the same districts in each one of those. But for those supporting candidates, which won 45% of seats last November, that's identical to April of last year, when they also won 45% of the seats. In November 2021, they won 56% of the seats. So there's a difference there between November 2021 and what we saw in 2022.
How about those opposing winners, the ones who might have opposed things like mask requirements and critical race theory?
Those numbers have remained pretty constant, around 1/3 of seats we looked at in each report. 30% in 2021, 36% last April, and then 31% last November.
And were there any other noticeable changes over time?
Yeah, the unclear winners, those where we couldn't identify a stance, that number has consistently grown in each analysis. In 2021, it was 14%, which was up to 20% last April and now 23% last November.
And why do you think that's the case?
We've looked at a ton of campaign websites and materials, and to me, it seems like candidates on both sides of these issues are starting to hedge their language a little bit, becoming a little bit more vague. So rather than talking about a topic like critical race theory or masking specifically, for example, we've seen more talk about things like parents' rights, which is a little bit more ambiguous than those specific policy things that we're looking at. That makes it difficult for us to identify a clear stance, but I don't think that's a bad thing, because we should also understand that these unclear data points, they're important pieces of this analysis, because typically the decision to kind of use a little bit less explicit language when talking about something is a deliberate decision that candidates are making. And it's really interesting that we're able to see that grow over time as we kind of get more and more iterations of these elections.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, we have all of this overview data, but we also can break things down by issue. So let's take a look at each of these conflicts quickly and pick out some key takeaways. You mentioned critical race theory. Let's look at that topic first. So race and education is what we call this one.
Sure. So of the 545 elections we analyzed, 531 had some mention of race and education, which accounts for 1,729 seats. So just about every election in our analysis had this issue come up. Among those seats, candidates who supported things like equity plans won 39% of the seats, and those who opposed things like critical race theory won 28%. The rest were unclear. And that was the biggest difference in terms of a single issue, the biggest difference in terms of supporting and opposing, an 11-point difference between the two.
And how about coronavirus responses? What do we know about there?
This topic came up in a smaller set of races, just 440, accounting for 1,450 seats or so. Here, candidates who supported things like mask requirements won 27% of seats, and those who opposed those initiatives won 30%. So pretty similar figures between the two. The unclear percentage here was 43%, which might have to do with the fact that COVID is in the rearview mirror for a lot of these candidates. The topic isn't really coming up as much these days, though it's still present if someone asks, like, did you like how the district handled the pandemic? That's basically the line of question that we're seeing nowadays.
Interesting. And then finally, sex and gender in schools.
Yes, this deals with things like gender-specific facilities, teaching materials involving discussions of sex and gender. This topic came up in 486 races, accounting for just under 1,600 seats. Here, opposing candidates won 27% of seats, and supporting candidates won 24%. But unclears were much higher. Just under 50% of winners had no identifiable stance on this issue.
Yeah, that's pretty high compared to the other two. Do you have any idea why that might be?
This issue has definitely been picking up steam more recently, but it still tends to be one that candidates bring up rather than outside sources. For example, news outlets surveying candidates typically don't include a question about this topic in particular, meaning candidates don't have to describe their stance. If it's not brought up, if no one asks you about it, you're not expected to just say anything about it. So the only time that we actually find stances is when candidates themselves are going out of their way to say what they think about this issue in particular. That tends to be the case. So I think that's why the unclear there is higher. But it's something that might get smaller and smaller over time if more and more candidates are pressed to describe their stances on these issues. I just feel like they haven't been put in that position very often yet.
Yeah, it's very interesting. If listeners are interested in a state-by-state breakdown of how these races played out, they can check out the link in our show notes. But to keep this episode from being an hour long, we're going to move on and look at the big picture in two different ways. From a political lens, using 2020 presidential election data, and then a geographic lens, considering if a district is in an urban, suburban, or rural area. So looking at our data, it seems pretty clear to me that the seat win share was split pretty evenly among the counties won by Biden and Trump in the 2020 election. Is that correct?
Yes. In districts located in counties that voted for Biden, supporting candidates won 59% of those seats, while opposing candidates won 22%. In districts located in counties that voted for Trump, supporting candidates won 26% of seats and opposing candidates won 44%. So a really clear mirror image there, it seems like.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially considering that school board elections are nonpartisan, but obviously some of these issues are more partisan.
Yeah, and overall, if you look at every supporting candidate who won a seat, so every candidate out of our entire analysis who had a supporting stance who won a seat, 43% of those winners were in Biden counties. Whereas if you look at every candidate who won with an opposing stance, 42% were in Trump counties. So it really feels like you've kind of, I don't know. I think a lot of conversations about these issues can talk about might focus on more swing areas, but by and large, what we've seen is that they tend to follow the partisan makeup of the district that was already there. It's not necessarily turning something on its head as much as it's reinforcing partisan leans that already appear to exist.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Let's now look at the data through the geographic lens, because often these partisan leans correspond to different geographies. So we broke down our findings here by 4 main types of localities, which are cities, suburbs, towns, and rural communities. How did the success of candidates differ depending on where the district was located?
If you look at districts located in cities of any size, supporting candidates won 57% of those seats, while opposing candidates won 24%. But as you move away from the city, that tends to change. When you get to the suburbs, it was 44% supporting to 36% opposing. And then in towns, 27% supporting, 31% opposing. Finally, in rural districts, 32% supporting, 33% opposing.
So just doing some quick math, it looks like the town and rural districts had a much larger percentage of unclear winners. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. In districts located in towns, 40% had unclear stances on all 3 issues. And in rural districts, that was 33%. And this is probably more a product of information availability rather than things that the candidates are saying or not saying. It's more likely that you're going to find campaign websites and Facebook pages and news coverage that we can just see, because we're doing all this all around the country from our computer screen. So we only get what we can find online. And you're more likely to see that in districts located in cities or in districts located in suburbs. But when you get into towns and rural areas, that coverage isn't necessarily always there. So it's harder for us to ID those stances if the only place where candidates are answering a questionnaire or laying out their stances is in a weekly newspaper that only does print copies. We're not going to see that. And so that's my takeaway as to why the unclear seems to be so much higher in those types of districts in particular.
Lots of interesting findings here. And Doug, we're so grateful to have you here to help us make sense of it all. Before I let you go, what sort of other research and reports are in the pipeline here at Ballotpedia that listeners and readers can look forward to?
I mean, 2023, odd years, they always tend to get this rap as being kind of like a lull. We're all just hanging out period. That is absolutely not the case. 2023 is actually a huge year for school board elections. States like Colorado, Pennsylvania, they hold all of their school board elections in odd years. And so we're really excited to dig into those races moving forward. But as candidates kind of become a little bit more vague with what they're saying, one thing that we're excited to focus on more this year is this kind of universe of endorsing organizations, because these groups that make endorsements in school board races tend to be far more explicit in what they think. And so we're really looking forward to trying to capture that and dig into that and provide some really cool analyses on that front in a lot of these states that are holding a ton of school board elections this year.
Well, that's really exciting. I hope your cat doesn't keep you too busy, because it sounds like you have a lot on your plate.
Oh, yeah. We're doing good work over here.
That's great. Well, thank you for coming back on the show, and we look forward to having you back soon again.
Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon.
It's Footnote Facts with me, Paul Rader. Guess who just celebrated their 5-year anniversary with Ballotpedia? This guy. Woo! Happy birthday. Oh, wait, I can't sing that, or else we have to pay royalties, which is absolutely absurd for that song. That's not an official Ballotpedia opinion. It's mine, so Warner Chappelle Music can take it up with me if they don't like what I said. Anyway, speaking of tenures, that's a nice segue into today's episode about the longest tenured officials in American politics, both today and historically. And here's the question for you to answer. How many of the 50 longest-serving governors in U.S. history have served non-consecutive terms? Now, oftentimes in elections, voters will be critical of candidates based on how long they have served in office. They may deride candidates as being what they would call career politicians, or on the other end of the spectrum, for being too inexperienced. Whatever the case may be, lengths of tenure in elected office can vary considerably because some state offices have term limits or a mandatory retirement age in the cases of many state courts. But Congress has no term limits, and we've seen 33 people serve more than 40 years in the U.S. House, with a record of just over 59 years held by John Dingell of Michigan. On the U.S. Senate side, only 10 people have served over 40 years, including Iowa incumbent Chuck Grassley. Robert Byrd holds the record in that chamber with just under 51 and a half years. But even the longest streaks in Congress fall short of the longest tenured state legislator in U.S. history. The record there belongs to Fred Risser of Wisconsin, who served in that state legislature for 64 years, retiring back in 2020. That streak was possible because Wisconsin is one of 35 states that do not have state legislative term limits. Now, state legislative tenure information is much harder to find in some cases, but what I can tell you is that at least 108 state representatives and 79 state senators across the country have been in their position since before 2000. And it appears Alabama stakes the sole claim to longest tenured currently serving legislators in a state House and Senate, with John Rogers in the House since 1982 and J.T. Wagner in the Senate since 1990. What was easier to confirm is state executive tenures. There are a lot more term limits for those offices compared to state legislatures. 37 states have some sort of term limits on some or all of their state executives. So because of that and the naturally far fewer state executive offices available, it is a lot more uncommon to see super long tenures there. But there are 12 executives who have been serving since before 2000. And the current longest active streak belongs to Wisconsin Secretary of State Douglas La Follette since 1983, and also was in the office from 1975 to 1979. One last fun fact, the La Follette family has been a fixture in Wisconsin politics for well over a century, starting with Robert La Follette, who served in public offices from the 1880s to the 1920s. With the La Follettes and the aforementioned Fred Risser tenures, if you want to serve a very long time in public office, Wisconsin's a good bet. What's also a good bet is me answering today's trivia question. Again, that was, how many of the 50 longest-serving governors in U.S. history have served non-consecutive terms? The answer is 23, and that includes the top 6 governors. Terry Branstad of Iowa is the record holder with 8,169 days under his belt, almost 2,300 days ahead of second-place Bill Janklow of South Dakota. But only 13 states don't have gubernatorial term limits, and 8 states that do have them have lifetime limits. So really, how are you supposed to compete with that? But I suppose the tenure of this segment has gone on long enough. So now, back to Victoria.
Thanks, Paul, and happy anniversary. That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug for coming back on the show today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another episode. And until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.